It is the most photographed object of its century. Gray, enormous, riding at anchor in a flat calm. 9 guns lying along the deck like something asleep. Newspapers print her tonnage. School children learn her name. Cigarette cards carry her portrait into 100,000 pockets. And on launch day, the crowd on the slipway is measured in tens of thousands. Because a country that can build this can build anything. That is not propaganda. Exactly. It is closer to a receipt. Everyone standing on that slipway understands they are looking at money. An unimaginable quantity of it. Made solid, painted gray, and floated in front of the world on purpose. And in the spring of 1945, the men who owned the largest battleship ever built sent her to sea with only enough fuel to get there. Not enough to come back. That was the order, written down and approved through the proper channels. Her own officers went around it. Base commanders quietly authorized topping her up to something near 60% of capacity, which is what happens when the paperwork says one thing and the men who have to stand on the dock and look at the ship believe another. Think about what that order actually is. It is a government doing arithmetic on an asset it can no longer afford to keep, and no longer afford to risk, and choosing to spend it in a way that guarantees it comes off the books. Everyone remembers what killed the battleship. The aircraft carrier, the torpedo bomber, the submarine, the usual list, delivered in the usual order. That list is not wrong. It is just describing the funeral and calling it the cause of death. On the outside, a battleship is the most concentrated military power a nation can own. The heaviest guns anyone has ever put on a moving object. Armor measured in feet. The single item on the board that decides who is allowed to use an ocean and who has to ask permission. On the inside, it is an asset whose entire value depends on never being risked, owned by governments who understood that perfectly, and who therefore spent 40 years buying the most powerful weapons on Earth and then organizing their national strategy around not using them. That is not cowardice, and it is not stupidity. It is the correct response to how this particular thing was priced. And it produces one of the strangest ownership problems in the history of anything. An object that gets less useful, the more valuable it becomes. 3 different things happened to the states that bought into this. Some of these ships genuinely paid for themselves, and not by fighting by making a fight unnecessary, which is the cheapest victory there is. Some quietly bled their owners for 2 decades and returned nothing that could be written down. And some destroyed the navies that built them, in a way that nobody in the room at the design stage was capable of seeing, because the thing that destroyed them had not been invented yet. By the end of this, you will know which of the 3 you are looking at in any given case. More usefully, you will know how to tell before the money is spent. Here is the line to keep in your head while we take this apart. Too valuable to lose. Too valuable to use. Battleship is one of those words that covers several completely different businesses, and if you do not separate them, the economics turn to mush. Split them by what the money actually does, not by tonnage or by flag. The first kind is the fleet in being. This ship is bought to be threatened with. It does not need to sail, win, or in some cases even leave harbor. Tirpitz is the cleanest example there has ever been. Over her entire career, she conducted 3 brief combat operations and spent the rest of it sitting in a Norwegian fjord being extremely inconvenient. While she floated, the Royal Navy had to keep a heavy force standing by in case she moved, and Arctic convoys had to be escorted part of the way by capital ships that had somewhere better to be. She won those engagements without firing. The cost structure is brutal and simple. Full expense, 0 revenue, and the return is entirely psychological. It exists in someone else's head, and you cannot audit it. The second kind is the decisive battle asset. This is the ship saved for one hypothetical afternoon. Japanese naval doctrine had a name for that afternoon, and a plan for it. The enemy fleet drawn deep into the Pacific, worn down, and then broken in a single gunnery action by a battle line built specifically to win it. Under that doctrine, keeping the ship out of every other fight is not caution. It is asset management. You are protecting the instrument until the one event it was purchased for arrives. The problem, which we will get to, is what happens if that event never arrives or arrives in a form the instrument cannot be used in. The third kind is the presence and bombardment ship. This one actually gets used. It sits off a coast and delivers ordnance. It shows up in a harbor to make a diplomatic point. It earns something you can point at. The American Iowa class ends up living here, especially in its later lives. This kind has something resembling revenue. It also has, as we will see, a payroll problem that never goes away. This is about the first 2. The ships bought as collateral rather than as tools. Because that is where the paradox lives. And because those are the ones that took entire national economies down with them. Start with the ship that started it, and with a small embarrassment, nobody can tell you what Dreadnought cost. Not precisely. The published figures sit at £1,785,683 and £1,783,883 and £1,672,483, depending on which set of books you open, and the Admiralty's own quoted figure of about £1,680,000 has been assessed by naval historians as a substantial underestimate. This is the most famous warship of the century, built in a country with an obsessive bureaucracy, and the prices range with over £100,000 of daylight in it. That is not sloppiness. That is the first thing worth noticing about this asset class. The accounting was political from the first rivet. When we get to Japan, it becomes considerably worse. Take the headline number anyway. At roughly £1.7 to £1.8 million in 1906 money. And understand what it does not include. It does not include the multiplier. A dreadnought cost over £2 million, roughly twice what a conventional battleship cost. So the ship does not simply enter the market. It resets the entry price for everybody who wants to stay in the market, permanently, in one launch. It does not include what it did to your existing inventory. Dreadnought's design so thoroughly eclipsed earlier types that every battleship afloat, including every battleship Britain already owned, was retroactively renamed. They became pre-dreadnoughts. Britain launched one ship and wrote down the value of the largest fleet on Earth its own in an afternoon. It does not include the annual bill that follows. British naval expenditure climbed from around £31.5 million a year to £50 million. And by 1914, Churchill was asking for £51,550,000. That is a peacetime line item growing by more than half. It does not include the people. Dreadnought commissioned with 700 officers and ratings, and by 1916 that had grown to 810. Every one of them is a wage, a bunk, a meal, a place in a training pipeline, and eventually a pension, running from the day she commissions to the day somebody cuts her up. And it does not include the financing, which is the part nobody puts on the postcard. Germany's tax structure limited Berlin largely to consumption taxes until 1913, with no meaningful wealth taxation before then, which meant that for half of its new dreadnoughts, the German government had to borrow. Hold that one. We come back to it, and it turns out to be the whole story. The purchase price of a battleship is the smallest number in this entire episode. Here is the thing that makes this asset different from almost every other object a state can buy. And it is a single mechanism, so we are going to take it apart one bolt at a time rather than pile 3 of them up. Most assets are valued by what they can do, or by what someone will pay for them. This one is valued by what it deters. And deterrence is not a property of the ship. It is a belief held inside your opponent's head about what would happen if they came at you. Which means the value of your battleship is set entirely by a third party. Specifically, it is set by the cheapest method your opponent currently possesses for destroying it. Sit with that, because it is genuinely strange. Your ship's worth is not determined by its armor, or by your maintenance, or by your crew's gunnery scores, or by the market, or by anything on your side of the ledger at all. It is determined by a number being calculated in a design office in another country, the number that answers how much would it cost us to sink this thing. While that number is enormous, your ship is a fortress and a diplomatic instrument and an argument that ends conversations. When that number falls, the ship does not change, not one plate of it, but its value falls with the number, and it falls without warning, without wear, and without a shot being fired. And that number only ever travels in one direction. Nobody uninvents a torpedo. Nobody forgets how to build an aircraft that can carry one out to sea and put it in the water at the right angle. Every improvement on the other side is permanent, which means the cost of killing your ship can fall, but can never recover on its own. To push it back up, you have to buy the counter yourself, more anti-aircraft mountings, more escorts, more aircraft of your own at your expense, on your budget, indefinitely, and all of that spending buys you nothing new. It buys you back the value you already paid for once. Now, put the two calendars side by side, because that is where this turns cruel. Your costs run on your calendar. Crew wages, fuel, boiler tubes, dry docking, ammunition, the shore establishment behind it, the training pipeline that feeds it. Those arrive whether or not anything happens. They arrive on a schedule you cannot influence and cannot pause. A battleship at anchor, doing nothing, in a harbor on a Tuesday, is spending money. Your value runs on somebody else's calendar, It runs on their research program, their engine development, their torpedo trials, their aviation budget. You have no visibility into it and no vote on it. So you are the owner of an asset that depreciates according to a schedule kept by the person who wants it dead, and you keep paying full price to maintain it against a value you no longer control. You can do everything right for 20 years and still watch the thing become a liability while it sits there gleaming. Too valuable to lose. Too valuable to use. Now the move that looks like the smart, frugal, thinking person's answer, and is not. Japan, in the 1930s, faces an arithmetic problem it cannot solve. It cannot outbuild American shipyards. Not now, not in 10 years, not with the industrial base it has. Matching hull for hull is off the table, so it makes the reasonable decision. If you cannot win on quantity, buy quality. Build a ship so large, so heavily gunned, and so heavily armored that it defeats two of theirs. On paper, this is efficient. It is more deterrence per yen than the alternative, and it is the sort of idea that survives every meeting because it sounds like discipline rather than extravagance. Then the bill for being unique arrives. A ship that big cannot be built in any existing facility, so you rebuild the facility. Its guns cannot be moved by any existing vessel, so you build a vessel. Its ammunition fits nothing else in the fleet, so that supply chain exists solely for two ships. There is no second yard that can dock her, which means one damaged rudder is a national scheduling crisis. Every specialized thing you did to make her superior also made her irreplaceable, and irreplaceable is not a strength on a balance sheet, it is a concentration risk. And here is the part that closes the trap. Because she is one of a kind, and cost a visible fraction of the national budget, she becomes too politically expensive to expose. The very quality that was supposed to substitute for numbers is the quality that keeps her in harbor. There is a second bite, too. To protect a qualitative advantage, you have to keep it secret, and Japan kept this one very secret indeed. But a deterrent nobody is allowed to see cannot deter. A credit rating you refuse to publish does not rate anything. So the money went out, the advantage went into a locked drawer, and the argument it was supposed to win was never actually made. The cheap route through the problem forced more spending on everything else, and then took the asset off the table anyway. Under the purchase price, there is a second floor, and it has 3 levels. They get worse as you go down, and they get harder to walk away from. First, the infrastructure. When Japan decided to build Yamato, no shipyard in the country could physically accommodate her. The building dock at Kure had to be deepened by about a meter so the hull would float in it. The gantry crane straddling the dock was uprated to 100 tons to handle armor plate. Floating cranes of 350 and 150 tons were built and installed. And because each main turret weighed more than a destroyer, a dedicated transport vessel had to be constructed for the sole purpose of carrying the 18-inch guns from Kure to the yards building her sisters. Read that again as an owner, rather than as an enthusiast. You are not buying a ship. You are buying a standing obligation to maintain a national industrial base capable of touching it, and only you can supply that, so there is no market discipline on the price. It costs what it costs. Second, the law. In 1922, the major naval powers sat down in Washington and agreed to stop. The result was roughly 2 million tons of warships scrapped. The United States alone struck 15 old battleships, some 227,740 tons. Across the treaty, 30 capital ships, totaling 845,740 tons went for disposal, and on 15 capital ships, still under construction hulls, with steel already cut, already welded, already paid for some $332 million of 1,922 money, was simply written off by signature. That is the second floor cost nobody prices in. Your asset can be legislated to zero by a document you signed voluntarily, because the alternative continuing the race was assessed as worse. This is harder to escape than the first layer, because you cannot outspend it. Third, and worst, the payroll and the escort. An Iowa-class battleship carried around 2,700 people in the Second World War. That is a small town that eats, sleeps, gets paid, gets trained, and gets replaced. And none of that stops when the ship is idle. Fuel behaves the same way. At 20 knots, one of these burns roughly 14 tons an hour, where a modern destroyer burns about 5. And at 30 knots, the gap opens to 51 tons against 16. But the real cost at this level is not what the ship consumes. It is what the ship taxes. A battleship cannot go anywhere alone. It has to be screened, escorted, covered. When Yamato finally sailed on her last operation, she went out, accompanied by 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers, effectively the useful remainder of the surface fleet, committed as bodyguards. The first layer costs you money. The second layer can be taken from you by law. The third layer makes the rest of your navy work for the asset instead of the other way round, and it does not get cheaper when the ship sits still. Ask the Royal Navy, which spent years holding a fleet in northern waters because of 1 German ship that mostly stayed in a fjord. Take the same asset class, the same doctrine, the same kind of admiral, and run it in 2 different decades. Run 1. 1916. The British Grand Fleet meets the German High Seas Fleet off Jutland, and the British battle line does exactly what it was purchased to do. It does not annihilate the enemy. It does something more valuable and much less photogenic. It survives intact, and it convinces the other side that the arithmetic does not work. The German fleet goes home. It never again seriously contests the North Sea. It sits out the remainder of the war as an expensive, unusable, deteriorating asset, and in June 1919, interned at Scapa Flow, its own crews opened the seacocks and put around 50 of some 70 ships on the bottom in a single day. Still the largest loss of shipping ever recorded in one go. That is the good year. Britain's battleships paid for themselves without needing to win, and Germany's proved that owning them and being unable to spend them is a way of losing slowly. Run 2. The same asset class, 23 years later, with 1 variable changed. October 1939. Royal Oak is at anchor in Scapa Flow, which is supposed to be the safest water in the Royal Navy. A submarine gets inside. She goes over in 19 minutes and takes 833 men with her. In German shipyard money, the boat that did it cost about 4.7 million Reichsmarks. Bismarck cost 196.8 million, roughly 40 of one for one of the other. November 1940, Taranto. 21 Swordfish fabric and wire biplanes that were obsolete before the war started cripple 3 Italian battleships in a night and have Italy's capital fleet. 2 aircraft do not come back. December 1941, Pearl Harbor. 8 American battleships sunk or badly damaged. The attackers lose 29 aircraft. And 3 days after that, off Malaya, Prince of Wales and Repulse are at sea, underway, maneuvering, guns crewed, doing everything correctly. 88 Japanese aircraft attack. Both ships go down. The Japanese lose 4 aircraft and 18 men. The British lose 840. And by late 1944, the exchange rate is out in the open, where anyone can read it. Musashi, sister to the largest battleship ever built, absorbs an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs over the course of an afternoon in the Sibuyan Sea, before she finally goes. 1 American strike wave in the middle of that, the one that did the most damage, cost them 3 Avengers and 3 Helldivers. 6 aircraft against the second largest warship on the planet. Let that land. Same asset, same maintenance, same steel. Between the good year and the bad year, nothing about these ships deteriorated at all, and the gap between what they were worth in 1916 and what they were worth in 1941 is the entire subject of this episode. If you want proof that this is structural rather than a story about bad admirals, the cleanest case is the man who got it right. Jutland, 1916. John Jellicoe commands the Grand Fleet. He is the most experienced fleet officer in the most experienced navy on Earth, running the most expensive object his country owns, and he is operating under a constraint. Churchill later put better than anyone, Jellicoe was the only man on either side who could lose the war in an afternoon. Understand what that sentence is actually describing. It is not praise for his skill. It is a description of an asymmetry. Winning at Jutland gains Britain very little. The blockade is already working, and the Germans are already contained. Losing at Jutland loses everything at once, because the fleet is not merely a weapon, it is the thing holding the whole strategic position upright. So the correct play, the one that any competent analysis produces, is to protect the asset. Do not chase. Do not take the low probability gamble for the high visibility win. Come home with the fleet. He does exactly that. It works. Germany's surface fleet never meaningfully sails again, and he is pilloried for it. For decades, the criticism runs that he was too cautious, that a Nelson would have finished them, that the greatest navy in the world met the enemy and let him go. The correct handling of this asset is publicly indistinguishable from timidity, because the whole point of the asset is that it delivers by not being spent, and there is no metal, No headline and no painting for a battle you deliberately did not escalate. That is the trap, and it has nothing to do with the man. Anybody in that chair, correctly reading the same numbers, arrives at the same decision and takes the same reputational damage. When an asset can only pay out by being preserved, the operator who preserves it will always look like the operator who flinched. And it compounds, because the punishment attaches to the right answer, which means the next officer who inherits that chair has a personal incentive to be braver than the arithmetic supports. The ownership structure of this asset quietly pushes every operator who comes after toward the one maneuver capable of destroying it. So here is the question that has been sitting underneath all of this. If a battleship is such a poor deal, colossal to buy, ruinous to run, legally vulnerable, tactically unspendable, and career-destroying to command correctly, then why did every solvent government on Earth keep buying them for 4 straight decades? These were not naive people. Treasuries fought over these numbers. They kept signing. They kept signing because the battleship was never really bought as a weapon. It was bought as published sovereign credit. Think about what a dreadnought actually proves. To float one, you need steel production at scale. Precision engineering to tolerances almost nothing else in the economy requires. Marine boilers and turbines. Optical glass and fire control. Armor plate, which perhaps 5 countries on Earth can roll. Dry docks, which are civil engineering projects in their own right. Thousands of trained specialists. And this is the part that matters, the capacity to fund all of it continuously for a decade without falling over. That last item cannot be faked, and it cannot be bought in a hurry, which makes the ship a public, physical, unforgeable credit rating for a state. Anyone can claim to be a great power. A dreadnought is the audited version of the claim, painted gray and moored where the foreign attachés can count it. And now the earlier details stop being trivia and start being evidence. Germany had to borrow for half of its new dreadnoughts because its tax base could not carry them. The ships were the boast and the financing was the confession. Japan concealed Yamato's true cost by burying appropriations inside line items for destroyers and a submarine, and to this day the figures are contested. The class total is sometimes given as 250,897 yuan, while other accounts put a single ship near 140 yuan to 160 million, or around 1% of the entire imperial budget. We cannot settle that, and the honest thing is to say so, but notice that the uncertainty is itself the finding. A government that falsifies the price of a ship in its own books is telling you the number mattered more than the vessel, which means losing one was never primarily a military loss. Sink a battleship and the owner's firepower barely moves. What moves is the rating. In public. In front of every neutral, every ally, and every creditor. That crowd on the slipway at the start of this were not looking at a weapon, they were looking at a prospectus. And that is why the aircraft mattered so much more than its tonnage suggests. A credit rating survives on being expensive to forge. When 4 aircraft and 18 men can retire 2 capital ships in an afternoon, the asset backing the rating is no longer scarce, no longer safe, and no longer proof of anything. The guns were the cover charge. The balance sheet was the game. Too valuable to lose. Too valuable to use. And now you can hear it properly. That was never a tragedy of overcaution. That was the product working exactly as specified. The yield came from remaining unspent, and the states that bought them understood that better than the people who later mocked them for hiding in port. Which leaves the question that finishes every asset story. When you want out, who buys it? Before 1914, there was a real second-hand market. Smaller navies bought capital ships. South American states ran a dreadnought race of their own. Orders were placed, resold, requisitioned, and traded. The pool was small, but it existed. And it existed because the credit rating logic worked for medium powers too. After 1945, that pool is zero. Not small, zero. No navy on Earth wants to inherit a 45,000-ton platform with a 2,700-person payroll and a target painted on it. And nobody is going to convert it to anything, because there is nothing else shaped like this. Time to sell, therefore, is not measured in months. It is measured in decades, and the price moves down the entire time. Recovery on improvements is close to nil. The United States reactivated 4 Iowas between 1,981 and 1,988 at a cost of roughly $1.7 billion on the later government accounting, about $435 million a ship, which is more than 4 times what each cost to build. They were modernized, rearmed with cruise missiles, and retired again within about a decade. Even as a museum, the meter runs. New Jersey went into dry dock in 2024 for a $10 million overhaul, which bought a repaint, 1,200 replacement anodes, and the inspection and repair of 160 through-hull openings. Permanently moored, going nowhere, and the bill still arrives. And where there is no market, there is no valuation. A bank pricing a factory has other factories to look at. A government trying to price a battleship in 1947 has nothing, no recent sale, no competing bidder, no alternative use for the hull, and therefore no way to establish what the thing is worth except by asking what it is made of, which is exactly what happened. The comparable, the number a valuer would actually reach for, is this one. USS New Mexico, 32,000 tons of battleship, was sold to a scrap firm in November 1947 for $381,600. Not damaged, not sunk, sold, as metal, by weight. Every asset story ends with the same reassurance. You only need one buyer. That is true here too. The difficulty is that for this asset, the last serious buyer was a breaker's yard, it valued the thing by the ton, and the maintenance ran the entire time you were waiting for it to call. The romance is real. That should be said plainly, because it is not a delusion, and the people who felt it were not fools. A dreadnought at anchor was one of the most impressive objects human beings have ever assembled, and the pride on that slipway was earned. Everything on this list is compatible with that. The economics are just complicated, and the people who understood these ships best were the ones who could hold both truths at once, that the thing was magnificent, and that its magnificence was the exact reason it could never be spent. So here's what actually happened, and it is not the story about carriers replacing battleships. Nothing about the ship changed. The steel was the same steel. The armor still stopped what it had been designed to stop. The gun still threw a shell 26 miles, and the engineering still worked on the last day exactly as it had on the first. What changed was the price of the answer. Obsolescence is not weakness. It is arithmetic. Next time we take apart something with the opposite problem, an asset that cost almost nothing to acquire, made its owners extraordinary sums, and destroyed them anyway, because the mechanism that generated the profit was quietly dismantling the market the profit depended on.